I recognize most of you, so I won't give a big introduction. I think this might be my 6th forum here. I'm Cody Sanders, Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care Leadership at Luther Seminary, where I've taught for the last 2 academic years now. What I wanted to talk about today is this notion of community and care, which I think we're all kind of struggling through in an era when things seem to be coming apart for us in many ways, particularly in an era of cruelty. And several people have walked by the screen this morning and pointed at it and said, yeah, I get what that's about. Because we do. We understand at this point what an era of cruelty is beginning to look like. And it is just beginning. So one of the things that I try to do in my role at Luther and in my education of congregations and continuing education of ministers is to talk about the role that community has in an era like the one we're living in, to catch people who are falling through the cracks, to literally save lives. And I have some stories I want to tell you as we go along today. This is a 2-part forum. We won't get through it all today. So next week we'll wrap up, but it'll be a continuation of what we do this week. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are rooted in this book that I've written that's coming out in April called Spiritual Care, First Aid, an all-hands approach for church and community. And the idea behind this book is that pastors are not the only providers of spiritual care in the congregation. At least they shouldn't be. And I want congregations like this to take seriously the resourcing of its members to provide spiritual care for and with one another. And this is sort of a crash course in the basic skills of spiritual care, from deep listening to asking helpful questions to what to do when you come across a mental health concern or potential suicidality or discover abuse and violence taking place. It's really an introductory guide that pastors and congregations can use to train their congregants in spiritual care skills. And I want to talk a little bit about this thing that seems a little unwieldy here, but I think you'll see how simple it is once I say it. This is basically my understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the human being. A bio-psycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social approach. If you work in the fields of like psychology, counseling, or even the medical fields at this point, the bio-psycho-social is sort of a taken for granted way in which we think about humanity. We are biological beings, we have a psychology, and we are constructed socially in these networks of relationship. More and more, you're seeing spiritual tacked onto that, the bio-psycho-social spiritual, because we have some sense of longing for relationships of transcendence that is trying to take into account. But what I also want to note here is that if we don't take into account the ways technology is shaping our style of being human differently today than it ever has before, then we won't quite get what we're talking about when we're talking about humanity. And we'll talk a little bit more about how technology is shaping the context of our communities in some helpful ways in some cases, but some really unhelpful ways in others. The other piece, the eco piece, is what we in Western society, but also in Christian churches, have often denied through our theologies and ideologies of human supremacy over the wider web of life. As if humanity, or human beings, stand over against everything else that we just call nature. So understanding the human being as completely bound up in this larger web of life is something that I also want to recover in this sense of what it means to care in community. It's not just human community, it's also the ecological community of earth beings beyond the human. So here's the little definition. We are inspirited body minds alive within a technospheric network of sociocultural political communities, inextricably bound within the wider web of life on Earth through dimensions of space and time and kinship. So the bio, psycho, spiritual, eco, techno, social. You'll see each of those sort of coming up throughout here. So let me talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about community in an era of loneliness. And loneliness is going to come up several different times in this 2 weeks forum series. And here's how we're going to see it. We're going to see loneliness on individual levels, how it affects us as individual human beings. We're going to look at loneliness on political levels, what it's doing to us as a society, socio-political sphere. And we're going to look at it on planetary levels. We probably won't get to planetary today, that'll probably be next week, but we'll probably get through at least the first, maybe the second. But let me give you some definitions here so that you'll know what I'm talking about when we talk about loneliness and isolation and solitude. Loneliness is a subjective experience. It is how we feel about our connections to others. A missing feeling of closeness, trust, or affection, feeling like you lack the social connections that you need, feeling stranded, abandoned, cut off from people with whom you belong. This may be vulnerable to ask, but I like to ask this in groups of people. How many of you feel like you have the quantity and quality of connections and relationships that you desire in your life right now? Just raise your hand. So maybe about half of you do, a couple of you sort of do. I think that's a pretty common response. I asked a group of college students this last week, and about a third of them said that they had the quantity and quality of relationships that they want in their lives. A bit different than you in terms of they're probably moving into this new community and reestablishing their social networks, but about half of you raised your hands. And that's what we generally see in the larger population of the US. About half of the people in the US say they experience loneliness, meaning this feeling of lack of connection to others, that you don't have the quantity and quality of relationships that you desire. That's what we're talking about when we talk about loneliness. What we talk about when we talk about isolation is an objective, physical reality, a state of being alone, being out of touch with other people, which is a risk factor for loneliness, but it doesn't mean you necessarily feel lonely. I heard an interview of Nelson Mandela not too long ago where someone said, "You must have felt really lonely when you were in prison all those years." And he said, "No, I never felt lonely." So we developed a community there between us. Even when he was in solitary confinement, things like that, he never felt lonely, he said. But isolation is the physical state of being cut off from systems and structures supporting belonging and inclusion. So this might mean moving into a nursing home, for example, where you have been living in a community of people that you've known all of your life, and suddenly you might move an hour or so away and you don't know anyone. That's physical cutting off of a relationship, which could produce loneliness or might not. And loneliness can occur in a crowd. It can occur when you're a part of a large community of people, but you don't feel the quality of connection to those people that you desire. Both of these different, as I might need to remind you as an introvert in the room, from solitude, which is a chosen experience. Solitude is about peaceful aloneness. It's the time that you actually need in order to be healthy, functioning people, to get away from others, space for contemplation, for restoration, that kind of thing. So what we'll focus on mostly is loneliness and isolation in the context of community. Now I want to give you a little framework for how I think about this theologically too. I think about this in sort of three interlocking levels of belonging. The first is a transcendence dimension. This is the dimension of belonging that we feel to something outside of us and beyond us. So we, in this kind of theological language that we share, would probably describe this as our belonging to God. Interlocking with our belonging to other people, this togetherness dimension. We belong with others in a human community. I imagine many of you would name this particular community of Mount Olive as a community to which you feel deep belonging. The one that we have often neglected the most, especially in Christian theology, is the tethering dimension, our belongingness to the earth that grounds us, that roots us in the wider web of life. So we'll think along these dimensions of belonging to God, belonging to one another, and belonging to the web of life as we go forward today. But before we move forward, I've given you a lot in terms of conceptual frameworks. Are there any questions you want to ask before we move on for clarity? Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I know that an elder of that did a lot of work with us was a teacher and taught classes for like all the people that were failing, and a lot of them were like, you know, football players or whatever. And he actually pulled everybody together and said, he asked a lot of questions, and then he said, you know, how many of you feel lonely? And all of them like put their heads down, because it's not talked about.
Yeah.
It's just not talked about. So people feel like, I think part of going through like puberty and growing up is learning how to deal with loneliness. And I don't think we talk about that. And that's why I feel like this is not the only era of loneliness.
Yeah.
But that we don't have the network around us, the social network to help us guide into maturity through what does it mean to deal with loneliness.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's one
Kind
of
of,
the things that,
I mean, thinking about that, just, it's almost like a failure to be lonely. So I don't know if you're going to get into that, but like,
Yep,
sort of it's your fault
right.
for that happening
Right.
to you.
You're just
If you would just do this, then you wouldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, sense of failure, the guilt, even shame of loneliness that keeps us from admitting that we are
Yep.
lonely. Yeah, it's a really pervasive experience. Other things you want to name or ask? This is sort of how I see the self, as nested in this interconnected three-part dimension of our belonging to God, belonging to others, and belonging to the web of life. We understand who we are in between these three intersecting experiences of belonging. So as we move through this, and you see this come up again, keep in mind that this is sort of how I'm conceiving of where our sense of self resides, okay? So many of you have probably seen or read this, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, which was the Surgeon General's advisory that came out in 2023. Anyone read that? About 3 or 4 of you. It's an 80-page report. It's pretty succinct and readable. It's sort of a meta-analysis of a whole lot of studies, sociological, psychological, cognitive, neuropsych, and things like that, on the effects of loneliness in the U.S. He found about 1 in 2 U.S. adults reported experiencing loneliness, which I mentioned before. And this was the thing that was so shocking about this report that really arrested our attention when it came out. Loneliness is associated with greater risks of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. It has about the same health effects on our physical bodies as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We'll talk about why there's a physiological impact on loneliness in just a couple of minutes. But before we get to the physiological part, I want to point out this haunting sentence from the Surgeon General's report that is so prescient right now, and it continues to bother me when I think about it. He said, "We will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or country." This was how the Surgeon General was seeing the trajectory of loneliness and isolation on our political contexts.
Is that report still available, or is it taken down?
Well, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if it's taken down or not, but I'm sure you can get it because it was a PDF document, so I'm sure it's floating around on the internet somewhere. If you can't find it, let me know. I have a PDF on my computer I can send to you. So, now I want to talk a little bit about something that's going to seem abrupt, and it was not something I had ever thought about until I was invited a few months ago to talk about what this group conceived of as the trauma of loneliness. And I have never thought about loneliness as a trauma response or something to which we can have a trauma response before. But it has really opened up some potential ways of thinking about this for me that I want to share with you. This is just a brief definition of trauma from a couple of sources. An inner injury, a lasting rupture or split within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. And this is really important. Trauma is what happens within someone, not the events themselves. We talk about events as traumatic, but when we talk about trauma in a psychological sense, what we're really talking about is our response to those events. So 3 people can be in a car accident together, 2 of them go away with very little effects on their psyche, 1 person goes away with PTSD. But they all experience the same event, but they have different responses to that event. That's the trauma piece. This is from Gabor, both of these are from Gabor Mate. A fracturing of the self and one's relationship to the world is the essence of trauma, Mate says. When I read that, I thought, wow. I mean, I read this literature for so long and never made the connection to loneliness and isolation here. And he's not making it explicit, but this sentence is one that just draws it together, a fracturing of the self and one's relationship to the world. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the greatest trauma theorists in the country right now, trauma is when we are not seen and known. Mate again, trauma leaves one diminished physically or psychically, more limited than before, in a way that persists in our capacity to feel, think, trust, assert yourself, hold your pain, sorrow, or fear, or capacity to experience gratitude, beauty, and wonder. Now, I'm going to move pretty quickly beyond this. We don't want to get bogged down in trauma. We could talk about that for a couple of weeks all by itself. And we are, I think, experiencing, in many ways, a kind of collective trauma right now. And keep in mind that all of the events that are occurring in our world right now are not going to land on our individual body minds in the same ways. Some people who are experiencing and seeing the same thing that you're seeing happening in our political sphere are going to have trauma responses to this, where you might not. You might see this really bad, but not have a trauma response to it. We can get back to that if you're curious to talk more about that in a bit. But let's look at the way this happens to intersect with loneliness, which is something I'm only just beginning to see. So our sensation of loneliness is an evolutionary gift. Loneliness as a feeling, as an experience, evolved with us as human beings because in order to survive in the early millennia of humanity, we needed other people. And not just figuratively or in some sort of connectional sense. We needed other people in order not to get eaten by animals. We needed other people in order to have enough food to survive. So loneliness evolved as an important signal to us that protected the individual from the danger, the physical danger of being isolated. So loneliness emerged in our psyches to say, you're in danger because you're not connected to the people who are going to keep you alive. Literally keep you alive. So connection equal to a feeling of security, isolation equal to a feeling of being physically threatened, because remember, in an evolutionary sense, this was about our physical threat and ability to survive dangers. And loneliness said, when it emerged in early humanity, pay more attention to social connections, reach out, get connected to the people who are going to keep you alive. So when that feeling emerges in our bodies today, most of us are not in danger of immediately, succumbing to an animal attack if we're not connected to other people. But our bodies still process that feeling of loneliness as one of physical danger. Now do you start to see why there are so many health effects on our bodies? Not just the effects of depression and anxiety or something, but the effects of dementia, the effects of cardiovascular disease increase with loneliness because it is a physical signal to us that our body is in danger. And having your body feel like it's in danger all the time is not good for our bodies.
Is the physical feeling similar to like an anxiety response? And that's why it would be like cardiovascular, because your heart, it's messing with your heart's pounding hard and things like that?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Yeah, so it results in the ability it affects the ability to self-regulate emotions. That ability decreases even at the cellular level, neuroscientists are saying, leaving us vulnerable to stressors and less able to self-soothe and heal. That's why loneliness disrupts our sleep many times. The body's ability to heal itself, to self-soothe through sleep. We may begin to see social dangers everywhere, even though they aren't there. Does this sound familiar? Distorted social cognition harms our ability to see other people's perspective. And feeling lonely in a pervasive way makes us less satisfied with the social connections that we do have, and more distrustful of those social connections. So this is sort of, remember, the self I'm seeing here is this point between, this nexus point between the transcendence, togetherness, and tethering dimensions. Loneliness sort of has this effect on us as we're cut off from these areas. I want to tell you 3 stories over the course of these 3 weeks. This first one is the longest one, but I think it's really worth telling because it's the kind of story we need right now as we're cultivating communities of care. So it's going to be a bit of a long story, but let me read it to you. It comes from an interview I did with a pastor about some pretty incredible ministry that she is doing with youth. She says the ministry began 3 years ago when this pastor began it, and she said, I started getting people asking to meet from our community about kids who'd gotten kicked out of youth groups or who were told that their church youth group wasn't welcoming to all. And they felt really betrayed, and their parents felt betrayed. Probably 5 or 6 people. I would be getting my hair done or having coffee, and someone walks up to me and says, hey, can I talk to you? She serves in a semi-rural area that is politically conservative with no other LGBTQ-affirming churches in the county, which is about a 40-minute drive from any type of social service resources for queer and trans people. And those social services are being rolled back more and more in her state right now. We've tried youth groups before. They've been a lot of work and not super successful because we don't have the kind of funds and all the big hoopla that some of the larger congregations have. So she asked some youth, including her own teenagers, what kind of youth group would you want to go to? And the response she received was, we want a place where everyone felt welcome. We want some place that's fun, where everyone can hang out and where it doesn't feel like there's always an agenda to change us or teach us stuff. We're already stressed out enough. They described desiring a group that was more about caring for each other. This is what the youth said when she asked them what they wanted in the youth group. Their church was just starting to make the shift toward LGBTQ inclusion at the time that she was having these conversations, so the youth's desires aligned with that shift in the congregation. And with persistent conversations that kept coming up in the community, this clear expression of a few youth, the pastor said, we had space, we had teenagers, that was what we started with. When they began meeting on a midweek evening, they started mostly with the pastor's kids and some of their friends who were coming to the group. For 4 or 5 months, it wasn't clear whether the group would work, but some other youth began coming from surrounding communities, some who were LGBTQ and some who were allies. They began playing games together like Pictionary, trying to alternate between more extroverted games like TikTok challenges and more introverted activities like artistic stuff. They rotated which youth gets to choose the music each week. At the holidays, they made gingerbread houses and told creative stories about what was taking place in their gingerbread creations. She said, we thought all teenagers like lots of rah-rah, but they don't all like lots of rah-rah. It was about learning to balance fun games with activities that give them a chance to dial down and talk. And they have pizza every week. They eat and talk for about 20 minutes or so until everybody has arrived, and then they go around and check in with one another. After this check-in, they begin whatever game or activity they're going to do together. One that they've developed over time that's become a hit is a kind of talent show, but they don't call it a talent show because it freaks everyone out, she said. But some of them perform and others bring art they've created, and some tell stories or talk about something that means a lot to them. And one teen insisted that she didn't have anything to share, and then one week showed up with a viola and played the viola for the group. And everybody helps clean up afterwards. They're careful in how they advertise the group because of the conservatism and LGBTQ negativity in their area of the country. Youth find their way to the group in a variety of ways, mostly word of mouth from youth who are already part of the group. But the pastor recalls once when another pastor from a neighboring town in a non-LGBTQ affirming church sent her a message And he said, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I have a kid in our church who is really struggling in our youth group, and it's not safe for them. Can I send them to you? So they started coming to the youth group. Some of the youth came with histories of self-harm and suicidality. Others embodied neurodivergences like ADHD. We just had to be like, okay, this is who we are. Many of them came to the group with defenses up, but after a period of months, we're developing friendships in the group. The pastor said, it was really incredible to see because most of these kids would never have been friends in school together. Some of the youth who were more reserved at first are now taking leadership in the group. She said they're able to take responsibility for the space. They take out the trash. They encourage each other. They talk to each other. They even talk to each other more at school, the pastor said. Several of them have said in recent days, this is where I come to be authentic. This is where I come to unmask. The youth group has become such a place of belonging for the teenagers who come that many of them want to celebrate their birthdays with the group. So anytime a youth has a birthday, they celebrate together. But that kind of trust takes time to build. The pastor says, I don't think you can build that kind of trust with teenagers in that population, especially as a church, quickly. It just takes time to build. They need to trust that they need to trust that you'll be consistent and reliable and be who you say you are. Most of the youth aren't involved in the Sunday morning worship services at these churches. Some of them go to their families' other church on Sunday morning. Some don't go to church at all. But the youth are integrated into many of the community events that the larger congregation does as a church. The town has an annual street fair that the church is involved in, and the youth are the ones who greet people at the fair. They help to decorate. They don't come to Sunday morning stuff and do our Bible studies, the pastor says, but they do almost all of our community outreach with us. Of the youth group, the pastor commented, I would say it's the most dynamic thing we do now. We started with 3 kids, now we have 15 and others who have graduated. Over time, the pastor has learned that some parents don't allow their teenagers to come to the group because they think the church is pushing an ideology. She said the only ideology that she can identify is, quote, basically being kind to one another. That's pretty much it. Some of the most encouraging stories she shared about the group are stories of transformation she's witnessed in the group. One trans teenager with a long history of self-harm who became part of the group inspired other youth to join when they witnessed the change and saw in his life something that was different after he was a part of that group. And they wanted to be a part of the group when they saw that change. This youth even asked if he could bring his mother to the group one evening so she could experience it. So she came and brought some soda and a game. Of this youth, another teenager said that one difference he notices in his friend is that the scars on their arms that used to be super red and bright and angry are all faded now. Offering advice to others who may sense a call to begin a group like this, the pastor said, our goal was not really to bring people into the church as much as it was to have the group be safe and reduce mental health issues for kids. I think the biggest thing is not to have an agenda with them, or make sure you're very clear about the agenda because they will see through it. They're teenagers, and they're very adept at seeing through people's agenda. It's just so easy to undermine all the trust you build when you have another agenda. Secondly, she says, be flexible. A lot of kids have things like ADHD, so be ready. Just be ready for a lot of energy. Often we go in saying, we'll do this, and then we realize, nope, this is the time of day it is, the medications are worn off, this is the group we have, so just be ready to change and pivot based on the kids you have coming. When it comes to working with queer and trans kids, she said, we found letting them lead in conversation about what's going on in the queer community is best because we're not members ourselves. We weren't trying to be experts. I think it's really important to help people have their own voices and start to step into that. They have space to become who they are and step into that and to have the agency and self-direction while still providing structure. She reiterated how important it is to really listen to them. And finally, she said, if we can do it, anyone can do it. I mean, we're coming from a conservative church background and a conservative community, and we're semi-rural. You could have a whiteboard and a marker and some Little Caesars pizza and somebody who can talk to people. I wanted to share that story just because I think it is a story of inspiring creativity in a congregation that was willing to do something that they saw needed in their community, that created really from scratch, a community to which some youth in their town or county needed. A community that was literally life-saving for many of them. These are sort of the pieces of that came together through the interview that I did with her. We have about 15 minutes. I know some people are going to need to go soon. I'll try to get to one more piece of this loneliness spectrum that I talked about, but let me stop here to see if there are any questions or comments before we move into this next piece. Yeah.
I think what our culture is so used to doing is thinking about putting a system in place to create the perfect community. And what this really emphasizes is that community is organic, and that if we listen enough, we know what's going to emerge. But if we try to shape something that isn't natural, it doesn't work. So listening is like the key thing first, and really providing that space for people to bring their own voice into it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In the early days of my congregational community care class at Luther, I spend a lot of time on helping students to develop deep listening skills. And oftentimes the students are really eager to get to the real stuff, like when we're going to learn the real skills of pastoral care. Like if you don't know how to really listen to people so that they know they're being listened to, and you're communicating accurate empathy with what you're hearing from them, then none of the other skills matter. That is foundational.
We all are familiar with the scripture about how, as the body of Christ, we all have different works to do, different skills. And I would also, I am not putting down anything that she did or you said, but it's just that I think different churches also are supposed to have different skills, different ministries. And for anyone, we are very unique in what we do, but no other church should try to be what we are, because that's not what they've been called to. And the same thing would be true for us, for a ministry that we haven't been called to.
Totally agree. And what she found, you know, in this county where she is, where there's not a single other LGBTQ affirming church, and no services within a 40-mile radius, was that was the mission they needed to live into. So, you know, whatever you heard from that story, these are the parts that I think come through to help inform whatever emerges for you in that direction. Not the specific things that they did, but the ideology of kindness, the posture of listening, and the mantra that it takes time to build trust with people with whom you're forming community. Consistency, reliability, congruence. I want to introduce one more piece of this, and then we'll pick up on this new piece next week, and that is what Hannah Arendt called organized loneliness. Anybody know Hannah Arendt? She was a German Jewish philosopher who studied the rise of the Nazis after World War II, and in her really famous work, Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talked about what she found when she studied the German society leading up to the Nazis taking over. One of the things she named was what she called organized loneliness. Here's a quote from that report. What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal societies or social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses in our century. So loneliness becoming an everyday experience for the growing masses was one of the contributing factors that she identified for the rise of totalitarianism in Germany. So do you remember that quote from the Surgeon General earlier? We will continue to fracture and divide in this picture. This is what he's pointing to, because I don't think he was reading Hannah Arendt. He was reading the scientific studies on loneliness. So I will introduce you to this little piece, and then we'll pick up here next week and move forward. This is some research from Mark Dunkelman at Brown that he published in a book called The Vanishing Neighbor. These are 3 circles of our relationships that I'll just walk through with you. The inner circle is family and close friends. These are blood and intimacy relationships. Your family members, your closest friends, the people that you would say, X, Y, and Z people are my closest relationships. This outer circle are our shared affinities, or what he calls the tribe. And the tribe is our political affiliations, our religious ideology, our national identity, the people that we identify with, even though we don't necessarily know the people in this outer circle. But we consider them a part of us, our political group, our religious group. This inner circle is what he calls the village, the familiar but not intimate relationships. So neighbors in your neighborhood, people living near you, those that you encounter in third spaces like coffee shops and restaurants and the barber shop or wherever. In this inner circle, he says, we learn love from our close, intimate relationships. In this outer circle, we learn loyalty to the group that we belong to, politically, nationally, religiously. From this middle circle, he says, we learn tolerance. Because these are the people who don't necessarily share our affinities and to whom we are not obligated through close bonds to love. But we encounter people who are different from us, people who hold different perspectives than we do, people who challenge us, but that we live with in this village that we belong to, that we talk to on a daily basis, and learn how to talk across differences. Now here's the piece we'll pick up on next week. As statistically people have started spending more time at home, you can look at the rate of takeout food versus in-restaurant meals to see this. And as individualizing technologies, first like the television that people went home to watch, and now like our smartphones and social media, as those have increased, the inner circle of love benefits from that somewhat. I can talk to my family 1,000 miles away in South Carolina and know what my sister had for dinner because we have a Snapchat channel together. And of course, with social media, this outer circle of loyalty strengthens because we're connected to all these people who agree with us politically or religiously, and the social media algorithm constantly feeds back to us our own desires, so we see more and more and more and more of what we already like. But what that individualizing technology and our tendency to spend more time at home versus in public has done is erode this middle ring. And the middle ring, he says, is key to social cohesion, the one where we learn tolerance. And as we start to spend less time with people in the village, because even when we are out in public, at the grocery store, in line, we are on our phones, or we don't go to the grocery store anymore. We get our groceries delivered or whatever. So this inner circle, a middle circle where we would normally encounter difference and have to learn to talk across that difference and empathically understand the other is breaking down due to this individualizing technology. There's some other things I'd like to share with you about that, but just to kind of graphically relate, again, what this is doing to us. I would kind of represent it like that. We'll move next week into a more political dimension beyond organized loneliness, into what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. And 2 months ago, I would have had to explain to you what that is. Next week, I'll just put some headlines up here on the screen, and you'll see exactly what organized abandonment means. And then we'll move into the planetary or ecological dimension next week as well. So stopping here, 5 minutes. What questions or concerns or statements might you want to voice before we wrap up? Yes?
My 14-year-old granddaughter, who's kind of exceedingly bright, asked me to buy her a book last week called The Anxious Generation.
Yeah. The Anxious Generation.
She said, everybody's reading it.
Yeah. That's Jonathan Haidt, social science researcher. The Anxious Generation is what she said her granddaughter asked her to buy. It is a really in-depth look at the research on what social media has done to youth mental health since about 2010 to the present. So a lot of this stuff is represented in that book. I would encourage you to look at that if you're interested in how this is impacting youth mental health right now. That's a great recommendation. The Anxious Generation. Any other questions?
I mean, so I mean, I have the feeling sometimes we're all living through some experiment that we don't know who's running it, and you know, I mean, just I think most of us are in this room are old enough. Like you think about 2005 to today, and just the difference of your daily life is just hard to even write down or explain. And then you add COVID into it, so then I don't know what, like, just asking more, like, what type of research have you been seeing that's even, like, are we even far enough into this to be able to name it yet, or are we still living through it, you know? So.
Well, both. I mean, one of the issues is it is accelerating so quickly that we don't quite know the next turn.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have lots of research and data about what it's doing to us, about how technology is changing our style of being human. So remember, when I said, in my estimation, if you don't take into account the way technology is shaping our style of being human, then you can't understand what it means to be human today, and what the problems are we're facing when we talk about loneliness, isolation, community, and care. Because this dimension of our life is having a really accelerating impact on changing our style of being human, even changing our, attention spans,
Yeah.
and what information we're able to take in. But it's also changing things like, when I pull up my maps on my phone, I will see different things than you see on your phone. Because the technology knows what I like, what I do, and it feeds back to me my own desires. Just as yours is your desires. So even our virtual worlds in which we live are different virtual worlds, which creates even more stress and strain when we try to talk across differences, and none of us think the same thing is going on in the world anymore.
She had a question over there too.
Yeah. Who's it? Oh yeah, I think it's you.
So, I think that the representation of the circles and seeing them as the the inner, sort of the middle and the outer, I struggle a little bit with this concept of sort of village, and that's where we experience difference,
Yeah.
diversity. I struggle with that because I think that I think that in some ways we idealize that in this country, and we say this is what used to hold us together, or the good old days kind of represents that center circle, and I think that it's a fallacy, right? And I think that for me personally, I see the difference as sort of a little bit more of rural versus urban, right? And that inner circle, or that sort of that's the mid circle, the village, I see as more like, where are we located? So in a physical sense, it might be cities that sort of feed back to our tribe and into our families, right? But then if you think about it from a technology standpoint, there is the sort of what I would consider sort of this rural environment, which feeds back to the tribe. We only think this way. Our values are about who's in and who's out, right? But then there's all of these, sort of villages from a social techno standpoint that exist, that we find those in isolation are drawn to, and they're in constant search of.
Yeah.
Right? But I do struggle with this concept of village, because I think that I think it's easy to sort of idealize what that is, but so many people never experience that. They experience the inner, maybe by the families, not really necessarily blood, but the families that they make, that are they're intimate. And then their other experience is just that outer ring, and that represents isolation.
Yeah, and that's
You know what I'm
often
saying?
been true for LGBT people who have needed to have that outer ring in order to find some community and affinity with other LGBT people who are not in that inner circle. Like I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, never knowing another LGBTQ person until I was in college. Of course, it was also just at the advent of the internet, so I didn't really necessarily have that access yet. But I don't want you to go away thinking that inner village thing is an idealized thing. It put us in contact with people who actually disagreed with us about things, but with whom we had to figure out how to live. And sometimes in a rural setting, they have gifts at that we don't have in urban settings, because if you disagree politically with your neighbor on the farm next to you, you have to live there with them. And you know each other's political orientations, but you still have to figure out how to have that kind of relationship. And it's not an idealistic one. It just is the reality of being put into relationships with people with whom you really disagree. And that's the part where we can more and more opt out of those relationships if we want to. And sometimes for good reason, like we want to remove ourselves from harmful situations. But other times it's just because we don't want to deal with someone who thinks differently from us. One more and we'll wrap up.
Yeah. On the surface, this seems like a simplistic question, but I think it's much larger, and I'm going to kind of hold off till next week.
Okay.
But it has to do with the connection between technology and being human, and this sort of simplistic suggestion to folks, well, just pull back from Facebook, pull back from Instagram, pull back from TikTok. Is that realistic?
Yeah.
Can we even do that anymore? But it's a bigger question.
It is, and it is, I think, the case that at this point, humanity, life on Earth, human life on Earth, in this size of humanity's life on Earth, can't even survive, literally survive, without the technosphere that holds up this our humanity. We can choose what social media we engage in sort of social media hygiene, so to speak, but to think that we can extract ourselves from the technosphere is a fiction at this point, unless it just collapses, in which case we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah. Now, so we'll get more into that next week and move into the more political and ecological.
Are you going to have some suggestions for how to fix it?
We'll work our way into some possibilities.
You can fix it, right, Cody?
It's good to be back with you today. I don't think I need to do another introduction because I think everyone
We know you.
was here last weekend. 5 times before that, but I've been here. So I just wanted to give you this graphic one more time to remind you the kind of overlapping circles of belonging that we're talking about throughout this 2-part series. Our belongingness to God, the transcendence dimension, our belongingness to one another and human community, the togetherness dimension, and our belongingness to the web of life, the tethering dimension that roots us in the earth community. We talked last week through the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, which Murthy, the former Surgeon General, issued a report about in 2023 that revealed about 1 in 2 adults in the U.S. experiencing loneliness, which is associated with greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety. And then Murthy had this line that I think was really prescient and ominous. We will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country, as he's describing the political and social effects of loneliness and isolation. Then we talked about Hannah Arendt, the Jewish philosopher who studied the rise of totalitarianism in Germany, who described one of the ingredients of the rise of totalitarianism as organized loneliness, when what had once been a condition of certain stages in life, like old age, has become an everyday experience for the ever-growing masses of our century. And I told you this week we'd get more into the political dimensions of loneliness and isolation. But before we do, I want to tell you this story, because I think stories are really, really helpful in figuring out how we today address these concerns in our era, not to replicate other stories, but to get inspiration from them. This is the Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco. Anybody ever belong to the MCC Church? Yeah, cool. MCC Church, Metropolitan Community Church, is a predominantly LGBTQ denomination. founded by Troy Perry. This here in the middle is one of my friends, Jim Matulski, who is the pastor of the MCC Church in San Francisco in the Castro district, pretty much the gayest place on earth. In the 80s and 90s, when he was just in seminary, he got this call to pastor the MCC Church in San Francisco. And I want to tell you this story because I think it has a lot to do with what we're talking about next, which is organized abandonment. This is a really poignant illustration of what that looks like in real life and what one church did in response. I'm going to read this story because I collected it from a variety of sources, both printed sources and my own conversations with Jim. He and I served together in the same geographic region in Boston for about 3 years. He was the interim at an MCC church in the suburbs while I was a pastor in Cambridge. Starting in 1986, Jim spent 10 years as the pastor of the predominantly LGBTQ MCC church in the Castro of San Francisco. Throughout those years, his church became the de facto LGBTQ community center. The doors always open for services, community meetings, weddings, funerals. Jim said, quote, "It was a protest every Friday night, which turned into a dance party." The church was growing and dying all at the same time, adding a second and a third service every Sunday morning, and also holding multiple funerals every single week. Jim told me at one point that he estimated in the 10 years he was there, he did about 1,000 funerals. And started with a church of 50 members. So that shows you how rapidly it was growing and how quickly people were dying throughout that decade. About half of the city's 60,000 gay men had AIDS, half of them. And there was no effective treatment in those early years. Jim said they were dying and in great pain, and in some instances barely able to talk. Each and every person I talked to was convinced they had brought this on themselves. They were worried about going to hell. Many of them were experiencing rejection from friends, family, and loved ones, including gay friends. Many of these men became untouchable in their communities. Everyone from family members to medical professionals to funeral directors afraid to touch a man with AIDS. So the MCC began instituting the laying on of hands at communion. When the minister looked at them directly in the eyes when serving the elements of communion, and with non-intrusive touch, using their name when possible, offered them a blessing that emphasized unconditional love. And if you go to an MCC church today, at least this has been my experience in all that I've been to, that element of the communion ritual is still in place. Is that the case for your?
Well, that was the case for me 28 years ago.
Well, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you go visit one today, you'll likely go and receive communion from one minister, and then go to the side here, and another minister or layperson will lay their hands on you and give you a personal blessing. And if you do that, if you go to an MCC church and experience that, recognize that that came from a time when LGBTQ people, specifically gay men dying of AIDS, had become untouchable. So the church instituted touch as a part of the sacred ritual of communion. Jim says it was an act of revolution as well as resistance, as everyone at the communion table, both ministers and parishioners, were excluded from the sacrament in most other churches. We were seizing communion back from our oppressors, Jim said. He tells the story of one man he would visit in the hospital in his dying days who said, "Will you hold my hand and pray with me?" Which of course I did, Jim said. And he said that the only person who would hold his hand and pray with him was one of the nurses on the night shift who always prayed that he would be delivered of his sin of homosexuality before he died. Jim says by the time anyone realized AIDS was sexually transmitted, the damage was widespread. The disease could strike a fit, healthy young guy, and he'd be dead in months. Our moods became darker, our hope dissipated, and I became kind of nihilistic. My capacity to sustain an interior sense of self-preservation waned. We felt like our world was dying, and this is impossible to communicate to people who weren't there. The only treatments for HIV available at the time required about 36 pills a day, which weren't very effective, and they made those taking them very ill. Marijuana was the only thing that helped with some of these painful side effects, suppressing the nausea so that they could eat and ease the pain a little. And where the city government in San Francisco ignored the use of marijuana among the city's gay population dying of AIDS, the California Attorney General, who had aspirations to become the governor, closed all of the medical marijuana clubs almost overnight. They began cracking down on marijuana possession, seizing people's assets. Organized abandonment here. Recognize what we're seeing, and we'll get more into that in a minute. Jim was conflicted about whether the church should step into this situation to begin distributing marijuana to men dying of AIDS. He contacted Phyllis Nelson, a member of the church with a passion for justice, whose son Glenn and partner Rob had both died of AIDS. Phyllis said, "Of course we will pass out marijuana, and I'll stand right next to you." Jim said, "This was after my own HIV diagnosis. This was a change in me facing my own mortality and made me realize we're only here as long as we're here. What are you being so cautious about?" My ministry changed right after that. So in 1996, they began to give out pot to AIDS patients in the church right after communion and before the closing hymn. "We had rules," Jim said. "No money could be exchanged. The pot had to be donated. People had to provide a note. We were promised by the supervisors and the health department that the city would protect us as much as they could. There would be no city prosecution, and they would try to protect us from any state and federal prosecution. They couldn't guarantee wouldn't happen." Jim said, "I took a risk. I used my body. I acted on a belief that was motivated by my desire to provide healing and comfort for my friends. And I didn't know what else to do that I could do, but this was something I could do, and I did it. And the risk was real, and the spiritual intensity was real, and the tangible relief for people who used it was real. Let your acts of love guide you," he said, "even if it means great risk. The greater love, the greater the risk, and you will never regret acts of great love." A story of organized abandonment when half of the city's gay population was dying of AIDS and the only things that were helping them were being criminalized and taken back. The church stepped into that place of abandonment with real tangible help. And I think that's a story that we need in our churches today. We need to be inspired by that kind of act on behalf of love and the risk-taking that it entails. Because we are continuing to face not only organized loneliness, but organized abandonment at this point. This is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an abolitionist geographer, who coined this term, organized abandonment. She describes it as the dismantling of and divestment from private capitalist structures and public structures that communities depend on, such as schools, public health care systems, and safe infrastructure, in favor of heavy investments in law enforcement, which is deployed as the lone remedy for all problems that arise from the deficits that divestment creates. I think if I had given this talk to you 2 months ago, I would have needed to explain this a lot more so you could understand what it means. But at this point, this is really all I need to do. I want to stop here to see if there are any questions or comments about the notion of organized abandonment and how you're understanding it now as you're seeing it unfold at a pretty rapid pace before our eyes. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that housing for anyone is quickly becoming out of reach.
Yeah.
I currently moved, and in searching for a place to live, I was astounded, particularly since my first apartment was $150, but now it's out of reach, most of us. But particularly the people, the human beings that face this organized abandonment.
Yeah, housing is a really big part of organized abandonment, and I do think that's a part of the kind of federal picture that we will begin seeing as well, because the federal government has a lot of roles and responsibilities and affordability of housing for people all over the country, and I don't think we quite yet know how that's going to be stripped away. That's a really, really good point.
I grew up in a community where my next door neighbor had her mother and 2 other people in the house that she cared for. You know, there was the men who came home from the war, and they managed to have a family in the basement in their transitional time. I mean, I just think it's not only the lack of housing, but it's also that whole thing of sharing space and our, you know, we have families have just, jobs have pulled families away from small community, the communities they grew up with. And that's, I think, impact.
Anything else on this theme of organized abandonment you want to raise before I tell you about a story that I think we need right now?
In the 80s, we lived in St. Louis, and we belonged to an Episcopal church there at that time. And we took in a priest who had been an assistant to a bishop who was serving at a larger, more wealthy congregation, but it came to be known that he had AIDS, and so he was expelled from that congregation. His name was Charles Buick. And I still pray with the gifts he gave me every day. On Saturdays, some of us would gather together, and he would serve us communion, and we took it. Yes, we did. And he recruited my husband, and I didn't find this out actually until after Jim had died. But he recruited my husband to go and pastor he had a whole organization of persons with AIDS, and he recruited Jim to be one of the chaplains for that group, and Jim spent 3 or 4 years sitting because of course they couldn't go to the hospitals, of course the doctors had no medicine for them. And it was very odd that I didn't find out until after he died that he'd been part of Charles's group, but there you are. He was a very private man who did what he did. And all of those, anyone who could physically come were welcome in that congregation. There was never any question about it.
Wow, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. Those are the kind of stories that I think we do need to recover and circulate more widely, because that's the kind of courage, compassion, risk that we need to embody right now in our ministries in the midst of organized abandonment. I once interviewed a woman who is now a minister and theologian who in her early growing up years was just kind of coming to understand her lesbian identity. This was in the 80s, and she had to do a service project for her high school where she had to volunteer somewhere. And her parents forbade her from going to serve at the AIDS crisis center in town. So she signed up to, you know, serve at the local, some kind of local thing in her town. But secretly, every day, she went and got on the train and went downtown to serve at the AIDS crisis center all throughout that time. So I think a lot of that work might have been done in very quiet ways, even within families. And I will say also during this era of the AIDS epidemic, the early years, was you know, the lesbians in LGBTQ communities were often the people who showed up when everyone else abandoned gay men who were dying of AIDS and cared for them through their illness and death. Another story that I really want to circulate more widely. You know the names Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, founders of the Black Panthers in 1966. Did you know that their first program of the Black Panthers was the free breakfast program for children?
Yes.
You know this story? It's a really great one. When many poor black children couldn't learn in school because they were going on empty stomachs, the community organized, and in 1968, the Black Panthers, now listen to this, this is where it intersects with churches, and I don't know that this part of the story is one many people know. The Black Panthers set up at St. Augustine's Church in Oakland, partnering with the priest and a parishioner and many neighborhood mothers who came together to feed the children for free before they went to school. And by the end of the year, there were 23 cities, chapters, in 23 cities feeding more than 20,000 children for free by the end of the first year of the program. When the National School Lunch Program Administrator was called before the U.S. Senate and questioned on the matter, he admitted that the Black Panthers fed more poor school children than the state of California did. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, said that the Panthers were, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And for no other reason but that they had refused to let their community be abandoned. And they created the free breakfast program. That made them a threat to national security. And Hoover authorized the FBI's attempt to destroy the program by forging letters to stores discouraging them from donating food and spreading rumors that the food was poisoned and raiding the breakfast program sites while the children ate. So this is what we mean by organized abandonment. And on top of that, the criminalization of care. And we have seen this more recently. I mean, I think one of the most poignant examples, not necessarily criminalization, but of sort of demonization, is when Bishop Buddy at the prayer service after the inauguration pleaded for mercy on behalf of LGBT people and immigrants. And she was demonized, yes. Bills were introduced to censure her and condemn her sermon. The criminalization of care. I mean, this is one of the times in which I'm always astounded that anything like congregational care or spiritual care or something like that seems radical to people, but more and more, that discipline, which I teach to my students, is seen as something that is radical and somehow a threat. And I have seen this movement in students too, where students are a little hesitant to lean into the practices of care that look like actual, you know, physical, material care for people, because they're not certain either where their boundaries are, whether that's actual congregational care work or if that's something quote unquote secular, as if caring for the body of people is not spiritual or Christian in some way. So this is bleeding over into many different areas, but I want to just lift this up for you as organized abandonment and criminalization of care, and the Black Panthers being a really good example of this, because in the end, the state couldn't win the fight against the Panthers. They were doing work that the community valued and needed. So the state subsumed the program with Congress's increase of funding to the National School Lunch Program so that poor children could eat for free at school. So even as states like Minnesota become leaders in feeding children for free, I hope that we will continue to tell this story and realize that we really owe the Black Panthers that success. Because when the government could not, through smear campaigns and raids shut down the program, the government subsumed the program and took it over, which in some ways is sort of a victory, you know, in getting the government to fund what it wouldn't fund before, because the community rose up and cared for those who needed care. This happened last week where the picture gets off just a little bit, so let me unplug it and plug it back in, which is the way to fix things like that.
Before you just used to hit them. Now you have to unplug.
Okay, here we go. Perfect, there we go. All right, anything you want to talk about with regard to organized abandonment before we move on to that?
Well, I guess everyone to get to your first, so how did we get here? I mean, what part did Christianity play in helping this kind of situation to happen in the first place?
That's a really good question. He asked, what role did Christianity play in giving rise to this?
And Lutheranism in particular.
It sounds like you have an idea about it. I would be really interested to hear.
Well, I think we abandoned Jesus' teaching of love your neighbor and love your enemy. And I think our church has been nationalistic.
Yeah.
And Christianity has been nationalistic. The Japanese thought that their war was justified. The Germans thought that their war was justified. And of course, I experienced some of this reinforcement of this when I was in the military. So, and I shouldn't have been in the military in the first place. I mean, why would I learn how to go and hurt and kill people that God created? And God loved as much as loves me.
Yeah.
Our refusal to see the divine in every face. So Christianity is still nationalistic, and we also, and it has supported capitalism. Western civilization was supported by the church. And maybe Luther didn't, but Luther also thought that it was more efficacious to kill a peasant than prayer. Yeah, and so we've been class oriented too, and all he seems to be kind of refusing to take Jesus seriously. It's not like Jesus had to be come, you know.
Yeah, that's a really helpful word. Anyone else have a response to that question and these prompts?
Well, it's somewhat related, I think. I made the observation at the time, which I don't think many people have remembered, and that is that when the COVID pandemic started up, there was a lot of hysteria too about people who were contracting this disease as somehow being at fault for it and ought to be exiled or ought to be buried as soon as possible or something. That sort of fell apart as increasing numbers of people were affected by it. Yeah. But it's always tough when a small number of people are affected by a particular disease, especially if it's something that's not readily curable.
I just want to thank you for raising up the African American voices as being our guides and not losing that. As we are facing this new administration, we can't forget their voices as being the ones we're standing on, rather than like it being whitewashed as we move through this process.
There's a concept in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error. But is the tendency to view my own failures as due to uncontrollable external forces, and to view the failures of others as being their fault. Some flaw in there. And that makes it easy easier to see the poor as, well, they're lazy or they're, have some, characteristics that make them difficult to employ, whatever, rather than, well, I'm out of the job because my company had layoffs and I have no control over that. Yeah, that's something that makes it very easy to, especially when the other is part of some definable group. It's already subject to stereotyping.
Well, I would encourage you to continue along these lines of inquiry, and especially the investigation into what role Christianity has in bringing some of these things about. And one of the things you reminded me of that I see quite often is the ways in which we tend to like teachings about Jesus more than we do the teachings of Jesus. And I observe this in churches, and I observe this occasionally in students, where reading the Gospels, where Jesus doesn't just go around saving souls, but heals bodies and restores people to community and confronts power structures and is ultimately executed by the empire that he threatens, is something they're not really interested in making meaning of that. They'd rather make meaning of teachings that we have about Jesus and what Jesus means. So that's one observation that I see in that question. The other, which has been kind of new to me, is this strand of kind of quietism in various religious traditions, which I think has some connection to Midwestern Lutheranism, at least one strand of Lutheranism around here, which I think is continuously inviting people to see their faith as having nothing to do with political action or social justice action or even care in community. In my own tradition, I'm Baptist, I see this historically when a religious group goes from being a minority to being a majority. For example, Baptists in the US started with Roger Williams, who was one of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who believed that the government shouldn't have anything to do with our spiritual lives, and that Native Americans should be paid for, compensated for the land that we took from them, and all these sorts of things that made him rather radical. So he was eventually banished to the wilderness of what we now know as Rhode Island, and founded the first Baptist church in America, where he, on this journeys back and forth to England to get the charter, was learning the Native American languages and creating dictionaries. I think at that point, the Baptist way of faith was really radical. And then today, being the dominant, numerically dominant Protestant expression in the US, has, at least the largest expressions of it, become much more nationalistic. So that dynamic of going from margin to center also, I think, erodes some of the more radical edges of the faith tradition.
Well, it's an interesting question about the Baptists too, because as I understand it, it was the Baptists who really pushed for separation of church and state early on, because they were afraid, because of what they were doing and because they were marginalized, they did not want to be controlled by the government and told they couldn't be there, which now that conservative tradition is very much trying to work towards theocracy and all kinds of other things, at least some in it, but they were the ones that wanted protection because they felt like these Anglo people, even the Puritans, were not going to be, they wouldn't be safe with them.
John Leland, Isaac Backus, their congregations were really they're the reason we have separation of church and state in the U.S. It was the Baptists who pushed for that because they were on the margins of these really state churches of Puritans and Anglicans who sort of were the established congregations. But moving from margin to center, that dynamic has shifted. There are still, as the namesake of my seminary's university, Mercer, Jesse Mercer, said back in the early 1800s, there are some Baptists who may be trusted. I don't know what he was referring to, but what I'm referring to and quoting him is that there are Baptist groups like the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is Jimmy Carter's kind of Baptist, and the Alliance of Baptists, which is my kind of Baptist, who are still very committed to separation of church and state. And the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty is one of the kind of stalwart religious organizations that continues to fight for separation of church and state. But the largest expressions, like the Southern Baptist Convention, have really gone in more nationalistic directions. One more before we move forward.
I just wanted to add the point that it's probably not quite accurate to imply that Christianity is responsible for bringing on these sorts of... That Christianity is responsible for introducing these sorts of evils because in general they existed before. And one point where it's very obvious is the Christianization of Norway, which took place in historical times and is pretty well documented. The violent Viking raiders were pre-Christians or non-Christians. They didn't become more violent after they became Christians. In fact, they became much less so. But it's something that exists in the human condition. It's not. Where Christianity, I think, is really open to criticism is that we have not adequately addressed these problems.
I think the terms complicity and complacency are the ones that are more appropriate to apply here. And, in terms of nationalism, around the world, we have Christian nationalism in places like the US and Brazil and Poland, but we also have Muslim nationalism and Hindu nationalism in other parts of the world. So nationalism is not even just a Christian expression either. That has really hijacked a lot of religious expressions. I want to move on a little bit because we're talking about this on the individual level with loneliness and isolation, the political level with organized abandonment and organized loneliness. And then I told you today we would get to the planetary level. Oh, let's see what's happening here.
I think your computer shut down.
The computer's still on, but I don't know.
Okay. It made it look like it.
Let me see if I can get it back.
Wound away.
There we go. On the planetary level, I'm going to talk about E.O. Wilson a little bit. Do anyone know E.O. Wilson? He's a Harvard biologist, entomologist. He coined this term, the Eremocene, or the age of loneliness, by which he means that humans are becoming a lone species on a once lush planet full of life. At the high end of the estimates, there are roughly about 1 million species of plants and animals that faces extinction in the next decades as the result of human actions. And this is what Wilson is pointing to by this term, the age of loneliness. So I want to introduce you to another term that I think is really helpful once you sort of internalize it, the term solastalgia, which environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined. And by this he means the pain or distress caused by ongoing lack of solace and the sense of desolation connected to the present state of one's home or territory. Chronic condition tied to the gradual erosion of identity created by the sense of belonging to a particular loved place and a feeling of distress about its unwanted transformation. Or the homesickness you have when you are still located within your home environment. So it's seeing the ecological landscape around the place that you know as home change so much that you begin to miss home even though you've never left that place, because the place itself is changing so drastically with things like climate-driven natural disasters and things of that nature. But I want to just take you through a little in memoriam slide of a few species that we have lost recently, the ones that we kind of can document the last known time when they have existed. Scroll through this, let you read them if you can. add a little poetry to this. An environmental philosopher named Deborah Bird Rose. I'll read this to you. Come back, you gods of old earth, sun bear, moon bear, panda, polar, grizzly. Come back, you desert dwellers, bilby, portaloo, nailtail, bandicoot. Come back, you majestic singers, Texas gray, Japanese, southern rocky, timber wolf. Come back, dear mates, dear jackal, wild dog, dingo. As loneliness descends and the spotlight grows larger, come back or take us with you, but leave us not alone without you forever. Come back. Part of this piece of things is one in which I think Christian tradition does have some really strong complicity in the rise of human generated ecological disaster. And part of this that I want to highlight for you is just the ways in which the biblical text relies so heavily on the ecological web of life to explain anything about God and our encounters with God. So we can see this in stories like Exodus 2 or Exodus 3, where the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of a bush. And he looked, and the bush was blazing, and it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. That's a picture of the first picture of a black hole. Mm-hmm. And I just think, look at this and think about Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaim God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And even when we get to the New Testament, and the one that is most striking to me is the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan. And we see Jesus come to John the Baptist, and as he is baptized, what? Yeah, the voice of God comes out from the heavens, this is my Son, my beloved, and the Holy Spirit descends in the body of a dove, which Mark Wallace at Swarthmore has called the double incarnation, where in this scene of baptism we see the incarnate Christ, God in human flesh, and in the very same scene we see the presence of God and the Spirit incarnate in the avian flesh of a dove. And yet traditionally, when we have taught and preached this text, we make it exclusively about what is happening with Jesus and diminish the fact that God's Spirit is incarnate in the flesh of another earth creature in this very text. So the ways in which we have read Scripture tradition, I think, has made it exclusively a drama about what is happening with the humans in that text of Scripture and the human's relationship to God. And everything else is just sort of the mise-en-scene's background against which human activity takes shape. So that has diminished our own spiritual sense of connectedness, of tethering to the larger web of life, which is bound up in our own sacred narratives. Which if you go through with a black marker and mark out all the places where landscapes and vegetal and animal life take shape, you'll lose some of the richest descriptions of God's relationship to creation. So let me stop here before I go on a bit and ask you to reflect some on these impoverished stories that we have told about our connection to the larger web of life that have largely cut us off from belonging to this tethering dimension of the earth.
I think that part of the problem is that we're still operating out of an old understanding of science. We haven't upgraded our science. I mean, technology has evolved way ahead of our understanding of what we mean by term God. And I think science can help us understand God when we say the word God, that in terms of energy and matter and so, and I think it's interesting that a Jesuit, when he became Pope, wanted to take on Francis's perspective, and he's talking about what we're doing to the earth and what we're doing to nature.
Yeah. And really good theological voices that are trying to recover or to educate us on this merger, like, you know, Terence Desjardins, who is also a Jesuit.
Yes.
Ian Barber, through some more contemporary folks like Isla Delio, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Delio?
Yeah, she spoke at St. Francis, and she blew me away.
Yeah, her writing right now, especially at the intersection of the ecological web of life, humanity, and technology, is really, really rich stuff. I'd encourage you to look into her work. Yeah.
You know, I think about this whole idea that the way that we have taken input human central within the creation story. That's me, the irony. It's like amazing. But you think about the how we have actually used that in this country. If you look just at our own history, in the way that that we have stolen the land of indigenous people, and part of how we've done that is to steal their own creation stories, which are much more, you know, rooted in God, in the, you know, in the world, in animals, plants, and, you know, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and, you know, my experience as a child and experiencing God was on the beaches, digging for clams, seeing the orcapods. You know, to me, that was the presence of God, and mystery was in the ocean and what God chose to reveal off the surface, you know? And it made sense to me because we were, you know, in the Pacific Northwest, you're present with the art and the of the indigenous people there, and so it you know, it feels familiar, but stepping away from it, and you see how conquest Christianity was used to sort of, you know, or Christianity was used in this means of conquest to strip these people of their identity and strip them by starting with their notion of what God is.
Yeah, and one of the ways that Christianity was complacent and complicit both in that is through the doctrine of discovery, which I find, well, when I introduce to students, almost none of them have ever heard of this. It was a 1490 or so papal bull that basically said any European Christian who discovers a new land can assume that if the people in that land are not Christian, then the land is empty. Now, what is really astounding by that is how that has become the root of so much law in the centuries since, such that I think up until I can't remember the year, but a case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion on referenced this doctrine of discovery kind of trajectory of law. It has become so influential, and that was, you know, of course, a Christian construct. And I want to give you this date here. I just thought about it when you were saying this. One of the best books I've read on Doctrine of Discovery is by Sarah Augustine, called The Land is Not Empty. Some of my students read it last year, and last semester in a course I taught them about Christian nationalism. And Sarah Augustine is speaking Friday evening, April the 4th, at 7 p.m. at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities in St. Paul. Her topic is embodying solidarity with indigenous people by becoming kin. So this is so connected to this talk. So I encourage you to put that on your calendar if you can. On April 4th, 7 p.m. at United. Other reflections on this that you want to?
Becoming kin just really resonates with me because that indigenous perspective is all about relationship. I've been doing a lot of work with them about water activism, and they bristle when people talk about managing water. It's like, the waters are relative, you can't manage it. It's, you take care of your relative. And that flows out with all of the way we deal with the creatures of the earth. Freakonomics just did a 3-part series about rats. And why do we hate rats so much? And why have we demonized them? And it's because they live well with us, and that annoys us. They're in our way. They're doing things that they do, and that creates a mess. And we're not in a relationship with them in any healthy way. So we go to war with them. It's really interesting.
I want to give you these titles real quick before I forget, because these are some books that I think if you want to follow up on this this talk with some additional reading, these are some good places to start. The two over here are a little more academic in tone, although Enlivenment is a really readable book, but it has a little more philosophical feel to it. These four have a much more wider audience feel to them, and Becoming Kin is one of the ones that I wanted to recommend to you, which is by another Native American author. And in terms of addressing organized abandonment, Let This Radicalize You by Hazen Kaba is one of the books I've read the last year or so that I think every clergy person should read, and every congregation that's committed to the expression of our faith through the work of justice should look at. It's a really, really practical guide for addressing things like organized abandonment. Before I move on a bit, is there anything else you want to talk through in terms of the Eremocene? About 10 minutes left. Another book, sorry for recommending so many books, but that's what professors do, I suppose. One of the best eco-theological books that I've read recently is by the man that I quoted earlier, Mark Wallace. And the book is called When God Was a Bird. When God Was a Bird. And what he's referencing by that is the incarnation of the Spirit in the dove. But it is a really beautiful, rich, eco-theological text. He teaches religion at Swarthmore College. God Was a Bird. Moving on just a bit, if you have a phone, you can open your photo app and just point it at this little QR code and then click a little link. This is, it'll take you to a Google Doc. That's sort of a multi-species relationality exercise that I've developed and used with churches and used with students over the years. So I'm going to offer that to you since we can't really do it together today. It would require us to go outside for 20 or 30 minutes. But I encourage you to save this and do it on your own. It's sort of a way of guiding you through not just appreciating nature, but relating to the larger web of life. And particularly attending to one being in that web of life that surrounds you with some intense attention, relationality, and communication. So I invite you to experiment with that and see what you think about it. And it opens with this poem, which I'll also read, that is so beautiful. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. There's another eco-philosopher, Glendinning, who sort of describes this rift between the human and the environment, becoming exiled from our own humanity because we are no longer in relationship to the wider web of life, numbing our sense of belongingness. She calls this original trauma, which I think is a really interesting lens through which to read the Genesis account of the expulsion from the garden. Original trauma, being cut off in some way from the wider web of life. And in the end, I think it is important to lift this notion up. This is from another climate psychologist, Steffi Denard. She says it is not cognition, but relationship, community, and a recognition of safe belonging that brings healing. Collective forms of trauma-informed support are needed in order to increase psychological resilience. Relationship, embodiment, community, and belonging soothe the nervous system and promote reconnection with what has been othered and marginalized. At this point, we have a lot of research that has piled up about how beneficial our relationality with the larger web of life is to our own body minds, getting us back to some of the original research on the effects of loneliness and isolation on our bodies. So what I'm hoping is that some of these ways spark some imagination for you and the movements toward sort of healing this rift that's progressively taken shape over the course of these 2 weeks between our sense of belongingness to God, to others, and to the web of life, so that we can begin to bring these back together again and heal, restore that sense of self that sort of rests here at the center of these aspects of belonging. So we have about 7 minutes or so. I wonder if there are ways that I can be in conversation with you further about what you'd like to explore in these 6 or 7 minutes we have. The things that are raised for you, you'd like to lift up or ask?
You know, I think that one of the things that feels top of mind for me is that the primary mechanism for sort of segregating communities, whether those are communities of people or environments or all of these things, is that is sort of destroying curiosity and empathy, right? Because those two things must exist. And one of the things that I am often concerned about is that in this sort of techno community that we now exist in, it's we lose curiosity. We're inundated by information and ideas, but we forget how to ask questions. And with the loss of that curiosity, we naturally lose empathy, right? Because we're not asking questions. And so it seems to me that that's like one of the primary mechanisms for separation.
Yeah, that's so great. Curiosity, empathy, and there's not only that sort of erosion of empathy, there is an actual attack on empathy right now.
Right.
We've seen that I think I recently read, I think it was a quote by Elon Musk about empathy and attacking the notion of empathy as a weakness. Again, let's add to curiosity the notion of wonder.
Right.
I often talk about, when I talk about the emotions that arise when our sense of the world feels on edge, like there's a pronounced ending coming, that sadness, fear, and anger begin to arise, which are really important messages to us that something is being threatened. And what we need to cultivate alongside of that, those messages of sadness, fear, and anger, are grief and gratitude and wonder. Because those are emotions that draw us out of our bounded sense of self toward others, holding collective grief, being grateful for the gifts of the earth, the gifts of other people, and looking outward with wonder that draws us out of our sense of self. And it's really interesting that, in Western psychology, we don't name wonder as one of the primary emotions. But in a 3rd century Sanskrit text that talks about primary emotions in ancient Hinduism, wonder is named as one of the primary emotions. And the way it's described is with the words seeing divinely. I think wonder does bring us closer to seeing the world as God sees it. And it is what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called radical amazement, which he described as amazement at the facts that there are facts at all. You know, being radically amazed by what is around us and moving outward in curiosity toward that. Yeah,
Oh, I was just gonna go off of what Gretchen was saying, that, and you also named it, that now there's a growing movement of Christians who are calling empathy, like the sin of empathy, saying that it leads to moral corruption, and also just like this movement towards, you know, you can't be soft as a Christian, which just feels really antithetical to the Christ that I know.
Yeah, and I mean, we think about that as something that is emerging from fundamentalist expressions of Christianity and Christian nationalism and stuff, but I see the nascent kind of seeds of that in some of my own students at Luther.
Yeah.
Not hard edge, like railing against empathy, but having questions arise in their own minds, like is empathy and care for others something that is actually a part of our Christian expression? And I'm really afraid that trajectory is leading us, not just in the fundamentalist expressions of Christianity, but in mainline expressions of Christianity too.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, a lot of this sounds like hierarchy is where we get stuck, like as a species, within our species, you know, different religions, so there's this idea that, again, not just loneliness, but like there's, I don't know, a better version. I think it's crazy that human beings think the world was created for them when it's 2/3 water and deserts and mountains, and like we can live on one little percentage of it really, but this is ours, we're gonna conquer it, you know, and I don't know, this is not a 5-minute question, but like Jesus showed up 2,000 years ago and the world has been around quite a bit longer than that. So just the idea that our religion and our species are, you know, king of the hill and whatever, it just seems very backwards to me. But then I don't know what to do with it either. It's like, well, we are human beings, that is our species, that's kind of our village that we're in, you know, so we want to do our best, you know, but
I think the one thing you can do is to see, especially to see the stories of our sacred tradition through a different lens. We typically read them through the lens of human supremacy, where everything is about God and humanity and how we are. But if you read the text of Scripture from beginning to end, you can see that the wider web of life is a participant in this divine drama, not the background of it, a participant in it. Even in the Genesis text where creation of man, the Ha-Adam, where we get the name Adam, the Ha-Adam comes out of the mud, which in Hebrew is the Ha-Adamah. Ha-Adam comes from the Ha-Adamah. This is, even in the sacred text of our creation, we are completely bound up in the wider web of life in relationship with God. But we typically don't teach the faith in that way. So partially it's being able to very consciously and intentionally shed our human supremacist lens of reading our sacred text so that we can recover something that I think is really there in the texts and in the tradition of our being bound up in the wider web of life in relationship to others, to God, and to humanity all at once. Because much of this is about the stories we tell.
Right.
Stories we tell construct our perception of reality and what we're seeing, of how we engage with one another. And when our stories are all stories that are told from the perspective of human supremacy, then we go toward this hierarchical construction of society where humans are the managers at very least, but more often the conquerors of nature. Yeah. Thank you for this really, really beautiful discussion. We're a minute past time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but thank you so much for having me back and for having me to talk about this in particular, which I think is a prescient topic at this time. And I did put this up here because April 15th, this book will be out, which is a book that is intended to resource congregations in the practice of spiritual care for and with one another, because this is a moment in which caring for one another is a radical act, and as someone who teaches this discipline in an academic setting, there are actual skills to care that I want people to be able to have and develop. And this is a really user-friendly guide to developing the skills of care so that you can be that kind of caring community for and with one another here in Mount Olive. Thanks so much.
Thank you.